بالله من الشيطان الرجيم أم حسبت أن أصحاب الكهف والرقيم كانوا من آياتنا عجبا إذ أوى الفتية إلى الكهف فقالوا ربنا آتنا من لدنك رحمة وهيئ لنا من أمرنا رشدا فضربنا على آذانهم في الكهف سنين عددا ثم بعثناهم لنعلم أي الحزبين أحصى لما لبثوا أمدا نحن نقص عليك نبأهم بالحق إنهم فتية آمنوا بربهم وزدناهم هدى.
Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to another episode of Boys in the Cave. This podcast is actually today proudly sponsored by Mizan Avenue and Lebanese Muslim Association, so LMA. Alhamdulillah, they've actually helped us to have a discussion with the one and only Dr. Samir Mahmoud. Dr. Samir Mahmoud, he's actually an assistant professor in the Department of Architecture at the Lebanese American University. He's received his PhD from University of Cambridge, researching comparative aesthetics, Western and Islamic. In addition to his several publications, he has also founded the Living Turath Initiative that looks at how we can make the wisdom of the Islamic tradition relevant to our everyday lives. And he's actually doing a tour here in Sydney. He actually you lived here, right? So,
once upon a time, yeah.
Yeah, so he's coming back to the best place in the world and giving a tour in around Australia. So on the Saturday, July 7th, he's doing a talk called Introduction to Discerning Between Haq and Batil in a Confusing Age. And also he's doing a talk from July 10th to August 16th in the evening workshop series, Al-Ghazali's Deliverance from Error. And also he's doing a one-day workshop on the inner dimensions of Salat. And we'll also give the links to that in our show notes and also in the comments of our Facebook page. So inshallah, people can check him out and check his talks out, inshallah. So assalamu alaikum, Dr. Samir Mahmoud, and welcome to Boys in the Cave.
Thank you, it's great to be here. Walaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Fantastic. So you actually told us, this is your first kind of podcast, right? It's a bit
yes,
of a
it is.
Different format. Like, we're actually the first for a lot of things, alhamdulillah, Boys in the Cave.
I'm actually pleasantly surprised that we actually have a radio program like this. So
yeah, subhanAllah, like it's actually podcast in itself. I think it's a growing format, and that's why we're trying to jump into the kind of the Muslims are getting hold of it. Like, there's a few big podcasts at the Safina Society that's kind of Dr. Shadi's part of, and the Mamam Mooks, very popular.
Based in Chicago, yeah.
And I guess that's for us, the youth have to kind of jump on board as well. So, and it's a growing platform, like especially with, technology, social media. It's easy, you just, plug in earphones, listen on the way. And so it's your major debut, alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah.
So how's your trip been? You actually landed 24 hours ago.
Yes, I did. I was touring the UK with a few events, Cambridge, the Cambridge Muslim College, and the Bradford Literary Festival, where I delivered a few talks on inner dimensions of prayer, Islamic aesthetics, Islam, sci-fi, and imagination, which is another area that I work on a lot these days. And then I hopped over to Germany and France and a bit of Switzerland, and then I came back. Alhamdulillah.
I think the perception of, for example, touring, France, Germany, there's like a Muslim doing a tour there. There's a lot of like Muslim reception. Is it good there? A lot of people turn out to kind of see your talks, because you see like the perception from living in Australia is like, there's a lot of hostility when it comes to going there and doing tours about Islam and stuff.
Look, obviously today there was a lot of tension in the air. One of the things that jumped out at me in Germany is the tension about the whole issue of immigration. Recently Germany, I think, admitted over 1 million or 1.5 million Syrian refugees, and so it's created a lot of tension in German society and a bit of a backlash. But the French already have a backlash against the large North African Muslim population that they have. In Germany, it's more of a recent phenomenon. And it's quite tense times in Europe. And this is the first time I go back to the UK where it's quite obvious that Muslims are afraid of their future in the UK. It's quite tense. The right-wing rhetoric is increasing, and many Muslims I know increasingly feel like they can't be explicitly, visibly Muslims in the way they used to. Well, something has changed. Something in the landscape has changed and shifted. On the other hand, though, I think the UK remains a place that's quite unique in comparison to other European countries. Where I went in Bradford, it is said that the Muslim population there is, or people of Muslim background and Muslim descent, is roughly about 40% of the population of Bradford, which is huge.
Massive,
in terms of the overall population of the city. And it has the most youthful population in England, but also has one of the highest unemployment rates. So you can see there's a lot of tension there. But it was Muslims who were at the forefront of developing the initiative for the Bradford Literary Festival, in addition to many others in the city, of course. And it's taken off as a citywide festival every year with hundreds of events across several venues. And many of the topics covered, like recently, Dr. Ahmed Mustafa covered the issue of calligraphy, sacred word. There was a few talks on Rumi, of course, and other aspects of Muslim literary culture. I covered a few topics on Islamic design, art and architecture, geometry, the inner dimensions of prayer, and I did a very, very well received also talk on Islam, sci-fi, and the imagination, attempting to link or to helping young Muslims to better navigate the terrain of contemporary sci-fi fantasy by drawing on the resources of the Islamic tradition. Many Muslim youth think or are unaware that there's a fundamental link between them. So it's very interesting.
Just to touch briefly on that, what would be the link that you draw between the Islamic tradition and sci-fi? Just as a brief...
very quickly, okay. I know
because that's not the content of our conversation, but we'd like to touch on it briefly.
You're itching to know. I was once like that years ago. Look, I grew up, and I think this is a really important topic that will lead us into the subject of today's podcast. A very, very important issue for young Muslims growing up today in the West, and increasingly also in the East, because I think the East-West distinction is becoming increasingly, to a certain extent, useless or irrelevant. In many ways, East and West are geographical locations within every one of us.
Yeah.
I grew up in Sydney partly, then I went to an American school in Lebanon. No difference. I was still in the Western cultural sphere.
Yeah.
And I went to university in Australia, in Lebanon, and the UK. Not much difference either. Still within the Western cultural sphere. At the same time, I was also anchored in the community in Lebanon in a Muslim context. So East and West is really difficult to demarcate where the lines are these days. But I grew up with a mixed cultural background, mixed cultural references. So for me, early Islamic or Arabic poetry is as indigenous to my cultural topography as William Blake is, and Wordsworth and Shakespeare. And so how does one relate to that? And so I constantly found myself drawn to many aspects of cultural expressions of Western and Eastern culture. But what they all have in common is, number one, the imagination. And number two, a genuine desire to explore beyond the visible world in many ways. And so the Islamic tradition, of course, is one of the richest traditions on the planet, bar none. It developed one of the most sophisticated theories of the imagination ever produced. And so its exploration of the realm of the beyond, and especially the world of images that it involves, often in Islamic tradition is called alam al-mithal or alam al-suwar, or the alam al-khayal, the world of imagination. And of course, if we have more time, we can get into the nitty-gritty of the discussion. But Islam provides a remarkable framework for understanding the nature of imagination and its central role in understanding the beyond, including God. And so, in my readings of people like Tolkien, for example, author of Lord of the Rings and other works, who, by the way, was a very important scholar at Oxford. He wasn't just an author of children's books. For those of you listening out there, he's a very interesting figure, very interesting figure and very interesting author. And his friend C.S. Lewis, of course, the author of Narnia. And Narnia Chronicles and whatnot. What these were attempting to do was to recover the importance of the spiritual dimension of our existence by drawing on the role of the imagination in doing that. And so they were struggling with the increasing lack of faith among many Christian youth. Imagine professors teaching at Oxford dealing with students who no longer believe in God in the early to mid 20th century, and confronted with the challenges of how to restore or how to help them restore the connection to their inner realities and the outer realities. They found the fundamental role of the imagination and storytelling absolutely crucial. And of course, the Quran employs the device of narrating the stories and haqa'iq of the prophets and their lives. The question then becomes, how does one relate or tell these stories to an increasingly westernized Muslim audience in a way that can relate to their existential conditions today? And so I found that the Islamic tradition developed wonderful theory of the imagination on how to do that, and a theory about the imagination that was so brilliant in terms of helping anchor the haqa'iq within the soul, that in many ways it overlaps and relates to many other traditions. Islam is not the only tradition that does that. And so my search through this literature, I found that there are indeed wonderful works within the Western context or cultural context that can be defined as spiritually edifying for young Muslims. There is a lot of work out there that's not good, that's harmful to the soul. And there's a lot of work out there that is very extremely beneficial. And we find in the Islamic tradition, whether it's the Quran or the Hadith or the many of the scholars who wrote on the role of stories and storytelling, fundamental criteria for how to help us then navigate through sci-fi, fantasy, DC, comics, Marvels, because we're inundated on a regular basis with all these images everywhere.
Stories,
And to say that we should completely block ourselves from it entirely may work for some people, but the majority are actually drowning in it. And so how do we provide them with the tools to navigate this very difficult and choppy waters? And that's what the work really revolves around.
So what you're saying pretty much is that Islam's own tradition of storytelling and the imagination opens up a space for us which in a sense meets with what the Western writers also do through their sci-fi.
Yes, but in a much more elevated way.
The Islam does it in a much more elevated way.
See, we're already a product of both Eastern and Western culture. Yeah. So when I ask myself, how do I relate to these traditions? Yeah. I need criteria, furqan, to distinguish between haqq and batil. And actually the whole theme of my tour here.
Okay, so how do you distinguish between what's worthy to sort of take in and what's not?
That's the important thing, because one of the remarkable things about the Quran and the Islamic tradition, it provides a furqan. Furqan is a criteria to distinguish between this and that. I think in an age in which we're inundated by so many images and so much out there, how do we distinguish between what is beneficial and what isn't? And we do have in the Islamic tradition the tools and resources to develop at least the basic guidelines for helping Muslim youth do that.
Yeah. So there may well be like many stories and novels and movies in the West that we experience today that are actually beneficial for us.
Absolutely,
in a certain
absolutely.
way.
But which ones?
Yeah. Okay.
And how do we determine that, and how do we measure that? Look, at the end of the day, is a sincere religious commitment to Islam or to any religious tradition incompatible with the fact that many of us are drawn to the power of sci-fi, fantasy, literature, and all the works of the imagination? Do we have to continue feeling guilty
about those things of the culture,
indulging in these things? It needs some kind of a resolution. I know myself growing up, I was caught in the tension between these issues. I practice my salat, I perform my prayers and everything, and then somehow in a parallel universe that I exist in, I'm then doing all this other stuff that I'm not entirely sure how it relates to my Islamic practice. They are relatable, and they don't have to be exist in parallel schizophrenic worlds.
I heard, you can correct me if I'm wrong, even Marvel characters like Spider-Man and stuff, they were actually created during the Jewish community during the Holocaust. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but what I've read is that they actually wrote those stories as inspiration during that time, obviously going through a tough time. And they drew inspiration like, Spider-Man who'd come in and help people. It was kind of a way to use the imagination in a more realistic sense of channeling, God's kind of mercy, but through these kind of superheroes, and they could actually relate to when they wrote stories about it. And even when I read it, I could relate to it as well from my Islamic kind of tradition, because obviously we know through Islamic history there were times that were tough as a Muslim community, even for now, for a lot of, Islamophobia and all that kind of stuff. And you can draw those kind of same sentiments from what the Jewish community were during the Holocaust when they made those characters like Spider-Man and Superman and stuff.
I'm not entirely sure if the origin has to do anything to do with the Holocaust necessarily. I'm not sure of that fact. But actually, in my initial searches, I found that DC Comic and Marvel's actually on the lowest rung
of storytelling.
Of storytelling and imagination in terms of their bad examples. They're examples of what when not to do necessarily. They're examples of what to do. And so in my work, I classify works like Tolkien's work in a very different category, much higher. Maybe we can have a separate podcast about that. But there's no doubt that there are certain elements of that are beneficial, or there are certain aspects of the storytelling there that is redeeming to a human being who's going through a very difficult period.
Even the recent Black Panther, I think it's done great things for the African American community, or even just African communities across the Western world, because that sense of identifying with a hero that's of your own and of tradition, as opposed to being located in Western society. So there's definitely that element.
You hit on a very important point here. It is beneficial in a certain sense, in that sense, yeah. But the question is, what kind of works of the imagination are beneficial spiritually in my journey towards God? And then you find that there are certain works that are a lot more beneficial.
Yeah. And
there are certain works that are a lot less beneficial in that sense, with this objective in mind.
It kind of relates to, but you were talking about, it was the Bradford writing.
In the Bradford Literary Festival, this topic was about what are the resources in the Islamic tradition? How can we distinguish? And so we got into a bit of a detailed discussion about that. It took a few hours to hash out a few ideas and thoughts. But I think because one of my area of work that I'm trying to do right now is develop a body of, let's say, guidelines. I don't like the word criteria per se, but a set of guidelines for young Muslims to be able to better understand the chaos of works out there. We're inundated on a regular basis with so much, whether in the literature, whether it's in the media, or whether it's film. And look, the basic fundamental issue is Muslims are watching these. How can we help them better understand it?
And I think the types of conversations that you just mentioned, I think like talking about Rumi and sci-fi on a kind of platform, I think not only can Muslim youth relate to it, but also other communities and other faith traditions can relate to it. So it gives that a kind of good perception of Islam, not just a good perception. We don't work for just good, but also kind of relate to everyone in that sense. So it's really good for those kind of initiatives to kind of occur, so that we can really rejoice as like one whole brotherhood, and really, as an ummah, even like the other faith traditions, so we can kind of go forward and not have that, so people don't have that fear of Muslims in general.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just to bring us back to what we originally planned to talk to you about, which was your engagement with the question of Islamic architecture, what you've done the majority of your scholarship on, or quite a large portion of it.
So you would have definitely, how long would you have studied something like Islamic architecture and design for? Because that's your niche, and that's something we actually want to hash out on, because there's a lot of, I mentioned to you before the podcast that people kind of study architecture like, it looks nice, or they look at it, or it looks aesthetically pleasing, but the history behind it and the development of how we kind of got to this type of tradition in regards to architecture and design, it's something that it's not really readily kind of talked about online as well. So right, what made you want to go into this kind of field?
And also just to add, people study it as a vocation. So they study what's already present. They don't have a look at the trajectory and what's created the certain forms of architecture that we have today.
I mean, one of the remarkable things about the study of architecture is because it's the study of space. Basically, architecture is how to choreograph space, basically, or the drama of life in space, as I like to describe it to my students.
Way to put it, yeah.
The choreography of the drama of life. And so, unlike any other discipline, architecture is extremely, extremely dominant and expressive of other aspects of culture. If you look around it today, you don't see artworks necessarily. You don't see music, but you can get away from them, but you can't get away from architecture.
Definitely not.
Roads, streets, cities, buildings, That's all architecture, and so it's the most dominant, if you want to call it one of the most dominant and most visibly concrete cultural expressions. And so, if it's done right, it assists a lot in cultural flourishing and the well-being of human beings. If it's done wrong, it does the exact opposite. It contributes to the sickness of humanity. I grew up in Australia, in suburbia. And like many of the people. You
mentioned earlier you grew up pretty much the same area as me, so
exactly,
you've got the same streets in mind when we're thinking.
And one of the things you notice about suburbia is that there isn't much architecture. There's a lot of buildings.
There's a lot of houses.
There's a difference between building and architecture. There's a lot of houses. And when you come into contact with, especially if you travel across the world, especially if you come into contact with the older architectural traditions, you travel. I have a travel company, so I do a lot of retreats to Italy. That's one of my things. I'm not promoting it on the radio or anything like that, but it's and I fell in love with Italy. You fell in love with the old parts of Europe. You fall in love with the old parts of Damascus, of Tripoli, of many parts of the Islamic world, and I began to wonder, like many people do, why is there such a fundamental qualitative difference between these places and then what we build today? Why are our cities so seemingly cold and alienating, and why do we have such an urgent need to constantly travel to all the cities?
Yeah, travel has become the new, I would say, form of consumption, but you could say like new sort of thing you have to do.
It's a new thing you have to do, but it's reflective of something.
Yeah, it's reflective of something.
Deep down, people travel for new experiences, of course, because somehow, wherever they may be, it lacks a depth of experience.
Yeah.
But many people who travel to older cities like Istanbul and Rome and Athens and Siena or Venice, they find something there that's lacking where they live.
Yeah.
And if you've ever done that, it's almost like a homecoming. And so I did the same thing, and I began asking myself, well, hang on a minute. I mean, what happened? Why is there such a radical difference between the way we used to build and what we build today? Why can I feel at home in Siena or Venice or Istanbul, and I just feel out of place in places like many of the North American cities or more recently established cities in post-World War I, World War II? And I began to discover that there's a fundamental philosophical, cultural shift that happened about a century ago, or two, depending on how you look at it, that led to an utter, complete transformation in Western culture. And that led to a different expression in architecture, and that then was adopted in the Islamic world, basically talking about modernity and modernism. And so architectural modernism is an expression of modernism and modernity in general, and that has had devastating effects so far in our cities, in the Islamic world. And it's come at the expense of the traditional fabric of the old Islamic city, and I began asking questions: why? What happened? And of course, many other questions are related to it. Why? How did colonialism happen? Why the seeming decline of the Islamic world? Why so radically different today, etc., etc. And that led me to want to study architecture, not to become a contemporary designer, but to understand the shift, what happened in this shift. Most architects, the majority of architects, never study these issues and rarely ever raise these questions because most of them are really interested in a vocation in architecture. But I think one of the major problems that we have inherited from modernism and modernity is the complete lack and a sense of history or complete utter rejection of the past. The fundamental principle of modernism is the complete rejection of the past intellectually. When you move on from Kant onwards, the fundamental question is not about how we can still learn from the past and from tradition, but how we can become autonomous individuals with our own will, unconstrained by tradition, unconstrained by anything outside our sense of self. And architecturally speaking, that's expressed in a complete break with everything that came before, and an experimentation with the new, for the sake of the new. And so by the early 20th century, you get a complete radical, if you look at the development of architecture, a complete, almost radical break. The buildings don't look like anything you've ever seen before because...
From 1900 onwards.
Because there's this conscious break with the past. The question is that a valid move? And it can't be defended philosophically speaking. One can understand the internal dynamic that led the West to move in this direction. One can understand it. It's not necessarily a legitimate move, and even if it is for European culture at the time, it's not necessarily a valid or justified move for other cultures.
The rest of the world, yeah.
And so, for us Muslims, the question becomes then, well, how do we, and not just Muslims, of course, but many traditional cultures around the world, Chinese, Indian, tribal cultures, how can we give a future to our past? How can we carry the values of our past into the future, and make a tradition that we have consciously rejected, a living tradition again?
Yeah. Just to talk a bit further about the architectural modernism that the world has sort of been engulfed in the past 100 years or so. So what exactly is a part of that? Like, what did roads, buildings, cities become that made them modern? Was it that everything became functional, as in that the sense of interaction with people was removed for the sake of like a better economy or better production, that sort of thing? So roads and suburbia replaced like integrated society where you would have like people living next to each other in the marketplace close by. So what would you say was like the defining features of that break?
It's perceptive of you to use the word function, because ultimately architecture in the 20th century becomes defined by functionalism.
Yeah.
And that's the idea that ultimately, if you think about a building in an abstract sense, what's the building for? It's for shelter. It's for protection from the elements. Essentially, that's how architectural modern defines it. And so, and the metaphor for building in the early 20th century was a mechanistic one. So Le Corbusier defines a house as a machine for living in, for example. Le Corbusier being one of the
descriptions they used for housing.
So this is one of the top theorists of modernist architecture in the early 20th century defines a house as a machine for living in, because the machine was seen as the symbol of a new age, a symbol of hope for a new future. And so look at a steamship, for example, he would say. A steamship, the form of the steamship, the way it looks, its shape, is perfectly suited to its function, which is to act as a steamship floating on the water with those big kind of coal chimneys emerging out of the... And so that's what a house is supposed to look like. That's what it's supposed to be. Why? Because once you stop looking at the house as a symbol of something higher, once you stop looking at the house or a home as having any specific historical meaning, once you stop looking at the house as somehow having some kind of a link to a cultural past, then the house is reduced to just an object that functions well. And so, drawing on the aesthetics of the machine, the house becomes an efficient, functional machine. And so, all of a sudden, you see these houses that are supposed to function efficiently like machines, but have absolutely no reference to the past at all. And so, this house could be anywhere. That's why many of the houses and buildings for modern architecture were designed not with an eye for cultural reference, but for an eye for efficiency. And if you think about efficiency as a universal, something that's universal, then houses pretty much largely look the same and function the same way anywhere. But if you think about houses or architecture differently, as something rooted in a particular place, as rooted in a particular cultural context, as rooted in the particular materials of that particular area, as rooted within the particular cultural meaning, symbolic meaning, historical meaning of a certain community, then architecture looks different in different places. And so that's why traditional architecture, from city to city and town to town, used to look very, very different, because it was very rooted in the place that it was. Today, in our postmodern age, we're trying to recover the distinctiveness of traditional architecture, because we've realized that modernism, by and large, in architecture, made a big mistake by overlooking culture, by overlooking people's historical references. It may have reduced the building to something that is not.
So in modernism, everything sort of became, you could say, like blocks. It became really structural, I think, from my reading. As in, it was called structuralism, a movement, I think, in the 60s.
That's a movement also within architecture, yeah.
Oh, yeah. As in, it became purely about... I guess it ties in with capitalism and the need to just have that output without any sense need for aesthetics, sort of thing. So is that what architecture became?
Eventually, it has become now. Yeah.
Yeah.
Architecture now, especially with the star architects, those big iconic names, where cities try to hire these big names to create these iconic buildings for them, to polish up the image of a city as some kind of a product for cultural consumption.
Yeah.
Producing these aesthetically appealing buildings whose appeal never lasts more than 5 to 10 years.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's the problem with modernism and postmodernism, is because they appeal to something so superficial. That changes very quickly. Taste changes very quickly, and so that's why every 10 years we find the architecture of the 10 years before that redundant or ugly. Whereas we still find pre-19th century architecture almost everywhere beautiful. Right? And so you won't find in 20th century discussions of architecture references to beauty much, because the goal wasn't something to be beautiful, it was something to be efficient. And many of those architects had sometimes the audacity to suggest that if people can't understand the superior logic of our buildings, then we had to inculcate it in them and teach them. Right? But rather than appeal to common sense of values and history and beauty, which was what was usually done in the past.
They appeal to mathematics or something like
Mathematics, geometric lines, cubes, solids, things that are not relatable immediately at any tangible level, but are very abstract.
Very abstract,
and detached from places.
I'd like to just add in, because we're looking from the perspective of kind of where we're headed is not the best in regards to how buildings look like. So just from a layman that is myself, what if I just eating fries and burgers and going home and using the house as a functional system to chill back, relax, watch TV because it makes me happy, right? So in what yardstick are we kind of using to say that the way that buildings look now is a bad thing? You get me?
Look, I'm not saying I don't want to say necessarily good or bad, haq and batil in these terms, because there's a lot more discerning needs to be done.
Yeah.
But I do think that one can't always take one's whimsical desires as a measure and yardstick for what is right, what is wrong. Let's use food for example. We all like burgers and chips, and on occasion when no one's looking and we're not in our suburb, we swing by Macca's, drive through maybe and get a meal and whatnot. Everyone tends to do that. I like the occasional fillet of fish.
It's the only thing we can eat from McDonald's.
McDonald's around here, halal, don't worry.
Yeah, okay. No, but but doesn't make it healthy.
Definitely not.
Doesn't make it right.
Yeah.
Obviously, it doesn't, and it's the same with many things in our lives today, where we become such in late capitalism, in this age of capitalism where individualism is rampant. We become subjects or people who are constantly trying to gratify our immediate and whimsical desires, and we often conflate a desire with a need, and we conflate what we want with what we need, and what we want with what is right, and this is where discernment comes in. In food, in terms of food, for example, nutrition, health, it helps us discern between the right kind of food and the wrong kind of food, what is good for the body and what isn't good for the body. Likewise, with architecture, we know for a fact actually that 20th century modernist city was a failure. If you look at the big car parks around big malls and the crime rates in many modern cities around these huge, massive apartment blocks that were developed to house the needs of the poor, but designed with no reference to anything beyond the functional need of the actual building to work. You find that there are many critics that have written extensively on the failure of this kind of architecture to deliver on its promise to create happy human beings.
As in the architecture itself impacts our mood, our lifestyle, everything.
Absolutely. Architecture, we often think that architecture is just a space where I can do whatever I want. Actually, architecture is either contributes to your well-being that makes you happier, or it doesn't. It's not neutral. It's never neutral. Nothing's neutral.
So it's not just a building which you can make your own way. The shape of it and its space, how it exists in space itself, creates the condition of your living.
Use of materials, the size of spaces, how they relate to streets, colors, all these elements create certain kind of moods and certain kind of psychological
I think
responses.
how the proximity places you in relation to other people as well. Like you're closed in your own apartment, something like that. You have no place to sort of meet other people, I think. Like there's plenty of articles now in the New York Times about how apartments are so isolating, even though there's like thousands of people that live in that small block, in that building, but no one ever actually talks face to face.
Even like I think in Japan they're making like all these like weird rooms where everything like you can pull out bed and everything, like everything is in there. It's not like a big size because people just want to go and sleep and get out and work. So they kind of where they live reflects them. Just want to get quick and done, get out, work, come back.
And those very same individuals then go take their holidays in either nature or in Venice somewhere, or Siena or Tuscany, so they can reconnect to the kind of architecture and communal spaces that they lack in their daily lives. One of the fundamental questions in architecture in the late 20th century, after we realized that many of the concrete structures that we built were just not helping in making people happier and creating good streets and good cities. One of the fundamental questions was then, well, how do we then create spaces where community can flourish again? You know, we know we've lost the sense of community. Capitalism and the logic of capitalism, ever since 200 years ago, is a very dangerous one, because there's a wonderful book actually written a few decades ago called The Great Transformation, and it talks about capitalism as a great transformation. The reason being is because before capitalism, all societies had markets where you went into the market and exchanged goods. But usually the market and its laws were bound by higher social, cultural, or religious ethics.
Yeah.
After the Industrial Revolution, many of our ethical codes and morals and social values are now determined by the market. It's reversed. And so we can now live as isolated individuals, moving from city to city and from place to place, because the market dictates and demands that we move in this way.
We move forward,
And we live as consuming individuals, perpetual consumption, which is not sustainable on a planetary level, because this is what the market requires. And so talk about the market as if it's some kind of a hidden entity that we have to bow to.
Yeah, it's like the religion now. How the world and the business dictates. It dictates your life, and you have to kind of adjust your life in order to go by what the market says. Because obviously it's not like, for example, Islamic ethics don't hold on, like at this current climate that we live in, you can't put like an Islamic code and everything will work by it. It's how do we fix kind of Islamic, finance, for example, into the current system we're working in. So it's an interesting kind of times, and it's very, you would say this is like the first time in kind of history, right, this to occur, or?
And it definitely is. Look, there have always been moments in history when cultures have been confronted with challenges, but I think modernism and modernity and the challenges of capitalism today are unique. They're qualitatively different from anything that's come before, and we Muslims really need to be aware of this, and we need to move from beyond the stage of negative reaction to positive engagement and offering some kind of a genuine alternative. I think we're at a point in human history where we need a genuine alternative, and it doesn't exist.
As in, we need to create for ourselves at this moment in time.
Not so for ourselves. The thing is, look, the one remarkable thing about the Quranic discourse in Mecca was that it was universal. It was speaking to the conditions of Arabs in 7th century Arabia, Mecca and specifically, but also it was speaking to humankind in general. And I think in many ways, though we Muslims have a tendency of thinking of ourselves as a community and ummah, we need to address our problems. I think at the same time, we need to think about our problems as quite universal. There's a universal cry and need for something else. And,
so we shouldn't see ourselves in some exclusivist sort of strain of like, we want to help our ummah, but rather we should help humanity at large. Is that what you're saying? Both, okay.
Both simultaneously, because there are certain problems that are uniquely
Muslim. Yeah.
But the way, I mean, we're at a point in history where Muslims, our destiny is so intertwined with the destiny of everyone on the planet.
Yeah.
That I think for the first time we're able to realize the full potential of the Quranic discourse to all of humanity. And the world, I think the Muslim world's contribution, in my opinion, is to offer an alternative vision of what it means to be a human being on this planet. Not necessarily the latest aircraft or the latest invention. These are important. But what's lacking is an overall vision of how to be an integral human being in the early 21st century. And that's where we need to start really thinking about things on those global terms. We have to participate in a global conversation that's happening.
Just that brings us to our next question. We were going to ask, so what does the Muslim purpose in architecture become then? What special sort of guidelines or frameworks do we bring to architecture that shapes it such that we can fulfill this sort of...
I'm glad you asked that question immediately after the previous one, because I think what is so uniquely Islamic in terms of aesthetic-wise is Islamic fascination with geometry.
Yeah.
Now, what I mean by that, I have to be more specific, because geometry isn't Islamic. It's universal. And it's common to all cultures. And there's a specific reason why Islam mobilizes creative energy and express it through geometric forms. I would more accurately say non-figurative forms. So you have figurative art, which is the art based on realistic images, and you have art that's based on non-figurative forms. So patterns, geometry, sometimes stylized plant forms, etc.
Yeah.
But there's a fundamental impulse in Islam as to why it did so. You have to understand, and this is why Islam is so relevant today in the 21st century. Islam emerges at a point in human history as a culmination of the prophetic cycles of revelation that were revealed to all mankind, or all humanity. And when we say all humanity, we have to emphasize all cultures on the planet, whether it's South American pre-Columbian culture, tribal Africa, or China, India, the Middle East, or Europe. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, has sent prophets and messengers to all mankind. And so, even though we're not aware or familiar with their names, everyone has been sent a nazir, a warner. Everyone has been sent a prophet. And so, Islam, when it emerges in the 7th century, then Islam sees itself as a reiteration of a primordial message that's been sent to all of humanity,
all cultures.
But not only that, it sees all other religious traditions or spiritual traditions as instances of itself. Islam recognizes the truth in every other religious perspective on the planet, and by necessity it has to do that because it is that final combination. And so when early Muslims began to explore and come into contact with other cultures, the first thing they did was to explore where is that realm, what is that perspective of truth that sometimes lies buried behind sometimes accretions or later historical developments that may cloud over it. Right? So they didn't see other cultures as entirely other. If we're one humanity from one God, but sent the same message through a diversity of languages and cultural expressions, then this relationship between the one and the many expressions is vital and important. You don't find this in many other traditions. Yeah. This emphasis on the universality. Any religion can claim to be universal. I had this discussion with a father in Bradford who said, Christianity is equally universal. I said to him, there's a fundamental distinction here. The universality of Christianity is to say that anyone in the world can become Christian. So that's one form of something being universal. But the universality of Islam is fundamentally different. It's not that anyone can become a Muslim, but everyone already is within their fitrah a muwahhid, a Muslim, in this specific sense. And so the universality of Islam means that its values, its aqidah, its fundamental principles are already enshrined with the universal human nature. That's what we mean by the universality of Islam. And so if that is the case with Islam, then as a religious tradition that comes to culminate and comprehensively embrace all other perspectives, it can't be just another perspective amongst the many perspectives, right? It's a perspective, or it's a view that embraces all within that one. And so, in its artistic tradition, its impulse was to embrace artistic form that likewise is universal. And that's a fundamental impulse behind its use of abstract or non-figurative or stylized patterns and forms. The image of Christ is very specific to Christianity. The image of Buddha is very specific. But Islam had to, by necessity, embrace those elements that cross these boundaries. And if you look at the history of world art, you find that geometric patterns or non-figurative patterns and forms migrate across cultures. They have no boundaries.
So the same patterns that started with Islam can sort of migrate and have its influence in cultures across the world.
So Islam embraced many of these forms from other cultures, and it gave back to the world many forms. The Christ image can't spread from culture to culture unless you become Christian. But the abstract geometric patterns of Islam, it adopted many of them from other cultures, refined them, developed them, and exported them to other cultures because it's addressing that universal substratum, that universal aspect in every human being. It's not addressing a specific kind of image. So when we say worship God in Islamic tradition, worship God, well, in what form? No form and every form. That's the paradox.
Wow.
No form and every form. And so Islam recognizes in Christianity, for example, and the Christian image of Christ, a certain relative truth, but it's not a universal one. It's not the whole picture. It's not the, and so Islam can't embrace a specific image like Christ or Buddha, right? Because it can only embrace all images and none. Right? And so, if to embrace all images and none, which is the principle of tashbih and tanzih in Islamic tradition, is the principle of similarity and dissimilarity, that the divine is like nothing in existence. In the Quran we find this wonderful Quranic verse, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٌ وَهُوَ السَّمِيعُ الْبَصِيرُ. There is nothing like him, but then he describes himself as hearing and seeing. Right? So this is the paradox of imagining the divine in the Islamic tradition. First of all, there is this balance between there is nothing like him, but at the same time imagining him in certain forms that we're familiar with. And this balance between tashbih and tanzih is absolutely important. And the second is the fundamental role of this balance means that there is no concrete image that can ever represent the divine.
So Islam's idea of art and architecture can sort of migrate beyond the bounds of Islam itself.
Yes.
I think, like in my study of history, like scholars have pointed out that Islam's cultural influence far exceeded how far Islam went, and that was called the Islamic civilization. And that's where sort of Islam's architecture and language and culture sort of diffused, even though people there weren't Muslim. So, and also fascinating is how you said that cultures across the world, we don't see them in opposition to us necessarily. It's just that they have truth, but it's buried under layers of their own cultural, I guess.
Which has implications, though. Yeah. Look at the way Islamic architecture spread across wherever Islam went.
Yeah.
Or wherever Islam spread, it didn't eliminate or obliterate local cultures.
Yeah.
Right? It embraced the best in them, and it embraced their form. So if you look at a mosque in China, it looks very Chinese. If you look at a mosque in India, it looks very Indian. If you look at a mosque, what they all have in common is that they are all mosques, and certain elements in common, like the direction toward the Qibla. But other than some basic reference points, many of them are deeply rooted in their cultural frames and references, because Islam must, by necessity, embrace those cultural differences.
Because it has no image to impose in place of it.
Exactly. And not only that, if Islam is coming as a religious tradition to embrace the fitrah that we all share in common, then it's only natural that the equivalent to the fitrah in art would be as universal. And so patterns, geometry, forms, anyone can do. And we're looking at right there's a grill there, and you can see that those panels. Anyone can do and discover the infinite possibilities of geometric form by doing it themselves.
Yeah,
right? And all cultures have done that. Whereas in the Western tradition, the image has been the center of art, and the patterns on the periphery. And the Islamic tradition, its patterns become central. That ability to connect and link all these. And if you've ever done geometry, you start always with 1 point, 1 dot. You start with 1. And you branch out into infinite variety, right? One, infinite variety. That balance between one and infinite variety is crucial to the universality of the Islamic message. And today, in an age in which there's so much confusion over cultural differences, and yet we are one humanity. And how do we navigate these seemingly sometimes irreconcilable opposites? Because for many, especially with the rise of the right today, there's this sense of, well, no, we're culturally different. We're not the same. Muslims are very different from us. And this us and them tension. I think Islam fundamentally undermines this artificial dichotomy by embracing both sides of the equation.
So, just for you to give an example, so when would you say was a particular moment in history that such cultural flourishing of Islam meeting other cultures occurred? Like, what do you find most fascinating? And if you could expand on how
I find some fascinating two periods really that are really interesting for me. The first was the first explosion of Islam onto the scene of human history. And maybe I shouldn't have used the word explosion. It's a loaded term, but here we are.
Conquest?
It's the eruption, it's called.
Eruption.
I like to think of Islam as a volcano that brings this wonderful, lava. Was that lava or magma that comes out?
Magma's when it's solid.
When it's
I guess
solid.
lava
Okay.
first and then the magma.
This wonderful lava that emerges onto the scene of human history. And the way in which it immediately spreads across, embracing and integrating and adopting so much. I mean, if you look at the early translation period in Islamic history, for example, they adopted from Indian, from Persian cultures, from Byzantine, Roman, Greek, many cultures. Why? Because Islam saw itself as reiterating the truth in all of them, right? But remolding them in its more pristine Tawhidi form. And so the confidence with which early Muslim cultures and openness with which they embraced other cultures is quite remarkable. And it has a lot of lessons for us today. But also it's expressed in its architecture. Look at early Islamic architecture. You find that, for example, in the Umayyad period, so much was borrowed from the Greeks, Roman, and Byzantine tradition. And Muslims had no problem with that. They didn't feel like, culturally inferior because they were borrowing elements from other cultures. Rather, they felt like they were reappropriating elements that are already their own. This is the crucial thing about Muslims. Today we're so enclosed, we turn inward. We're different, and the world is different, and we're us and them. Sometimes this mentality that does exist among some Muslims, but the early openness of early Muslims is quite remarkable in that sense. And if you look at many of the buildings built in Syria or the Sham, the Levant, and during the Umayyad period, you're hard pressed to distinguish between some of the details that are very Byzantine or Roman and the Islamic. No problem with that. Someone might say, look, your Islamic culture is derived from Byzantine because, look, there are elements. Muslim doesn't recoil and say, no. Muslim says,
we accept.
Yes, of course, that's the whole point. Islam is not a message that claims to be entirely new, but a reiteration of Tawheed, the primordial truth. So it's a witness to this message that's been around for thousands of years. Right? But it has to do so within a certain criteria between haqq and batin. Right? It does so with discernment. The second really important moment, I think, that's really crucial and interesting in Islamic history is the post-Mongol invasion, or the post-Crusader invasion, but mainly the post-Mongol, when the Mongols swept across the Middle East, destroying everything.
Around the 1200s, 1100s?
We're talking about late 13th century, mid to late 13th century.
Yeah.
So 1250s onwards.
When Ibn Taymiyyah was around?
That's when he was writing, at a time when the Muslim world was conquered by the Mongols, which sometimes explains Sheikh Ibn Taymiyyah's often very strong position on certain issues. But the period immediately afterwards witnesses what is considered the great golden age of Islam. People often think the golden age of Islam was the early period, the Abbasid period. Actually, the greatest golden age of Islam came after the Mongol period, and Muslim culture was rejuvenated and reached intellectual, spiritual heights unrivaled before in the early period. And so if that says anything, it says it reflects the ability of Islam to really rise from the ashes after what was one can consider a global catastrophe at the time. The Mongols conquered and destroyed everything from China all the way across to Eastern Europe and across the Middle East to Damascus, where they were defeated, a very famous battle. And so, but the period afterwards also showed this remarkable flourishing of Islamic culture. And so, whether it's in the arts or in the architecture or intellectual history or development of spiritual tradition or mysticism in Islam, and it's reaching culminating heights unseen before. These two periods, I think, are really, really crucial. Why? Because they're also very relevant for us today. Many Muslims feel like, colonialism was a period in which we were just swept off the face of history, dominated and controlled and everything. But colonialism was only 100 years ago. It took Muslims a century or two to recover from the Mongol invasions and produce some of the most remarkable architectural, artistic works.
We might still be in that process of recovering.
I think we're in a similar process, but also different, because we're talking about a global scale event here, not just a regional one. And also the early period, because of its ability to, if you look at the Middle East at the time, or Greater Middle East, from India and China to West Africa and Byzantine world to the Mediterranean, it's like a mini globalization happening. Islam emerges onto the scene, it's encountering 15, 16 different cultures, over 100 languages, different civilizational entities. And what's it doing?
Spreading Islam by the Sunnah.
It's, I mean, in some places, largely speaking, if you look at Islamic history, in some places, Islam entered into countries through the sword. But people didn't convert to Islam at the edge of the sword. That's the difference. Very rarely did that happen. So what was the power, the cultural power of this Islamic message, where large numbers of people were entering into Islam? It was this fundamental universal message that resonated with people's fitrah. And today, when you're able to bypass many of people's psychological barriers and prejudice against Islam, if you're somehow able to do so, and I'll give you an example of an instance where I've done that successfully, you feel people just shake their head noddingly and approvingly and say, this just makes sense. Let me give you two examples. Earlier we mentioned the example of Islam's universality, right? There's a wonderful tradition a genre of writing in the Islamic tradition where you have this young youth who grows up on an island somewhere. Hayban Laksan story of Ibn Tufayl, for example. And that youth somehow, through his or her own faculty, by being raised by animals and observing nature, discovers that there is the All One. And
it's
that
like
we come from the one, and the one we shall return.
The Robinson Crusoe.
That's derived from Hayban Laksan in a sense. In a sense, it inspired it, because Hayban Laksan, Ibn Tufayl Hayban Laksan was read by people like Rousseau and John Locke.
In the translations.
Through translations. Of course, John Locke's colleague at Cambridge translated the work, and he had the copy in his own library. And Hayban Laksan was very crucial to the discussion of Enlightenment ideas at the time about the nature of the individual, society, and nature. It was absolutely crucial. Hayban Laksan was one of the most widely read texts among these intellectuals. And later on, it inspired the genre of people like Robinson Crusoe's the novel, the story. But more importantly, the youth who grows up on an island away from civilization, later, as he matures into an adult, encounters someone, a scholar who comes from another island where there's civilization, where there's Islam and everything. And the crux of the story is that the youth already knows the essence of what the scholar knows through books. And the scholar is amazed to find out that this youth has already discovered the haqa'iq, or truth, without scholarly assistance. which shows this fitrah basis. This universality, you can't really, for example, growing up on an island, you'll never discover that God had a son who came to earth, died 3 days later, was resurrected. Right? The saving truth of Christianity is not a fitrah thing that you can discover. Yeah. It doesn't resonate with the depths. Yeah. And that's a fundamental difference here in this story. The second example I want to give you very quickly is, I was in Spain a few years ago, and the German friends were sitting at a restaurant, and they asked, do you eat meat? And I said, no. And they didn't know I was Muslim yet. And I said, why? I said, well, I'm very conscious and conscientious about the kind of meat I eat. Can you explain? And so I was like, I need to make sure that the animals were treated well in the habitat, that they weren't killed in front of each other. There was an utmost degree of compassion, and that the all-compassionate divine was invoked. And they're like, oh my God, that's amazing. Yeah, no, you know what? I'm not going to eat. So a few people eat meat. And then they asked me, and at the end of the lunch, I explained that's halal meat,
He's like, oh man, I want to eat my meat again.
And so, because I didn't start with, I'm Muslim, this is halal meat, I don't eat this stuff, that's it, in the story, and give like a blank
barrier,
No, you explain. And I often give a wonderful example of the first scene in The Last of the Mohicans, if you've ever seen the movie.
I've heard of it. Many people reference it.
It's a movie about a last member of a dying Native American tribe. Yeah. But the first scene is where he's killing the animal, invoking the Great Spirit in the process. It's a wonderful scene, quite moving. I think if we're able to communicate more effectively, any of these elements would resonate with any human being.
If you can explain the, not rationale, but the wisdom and meaning behind our practices.
Absolutely. Yeah. Instead of insisting and saying, I'm a Muslim, this is my right. I demand it. Now, meet the others on the equal plane of our humanity, which is what the Quran... But then even if you do that, sometimes you'll always find people who reject that, which is fine. But I think we need to shift our discourse.
It's like, because you were talking about the Robinson Crusoe example. It's like the West is stealing all our scriptures and stuff. But I want to touch on what you just said, because that reminds me, even Rasulullah, there's like Hadith where the boy came up to Rasulullah, make zina permissible for me, but Rasulullah just said, wasn't like, what are you doing? Like, it's haram. Get out of here. You know what I mean? He explained the wisdom behind it, you know what I mean? Like, how would you feel if your mother was in that situation, or that kind of stuff. Yeah. So that's like similar to what you're saying, but obviously doing it in the modern context that we're living in that sense. And touching what you said before, you're talking about how Islam kind of encounters other civilizations, and it's like a healing process. It's like it takes the good, leaves the batil, right? So that even reminds me of the Ibn Sina. Like, I'm not too well versed with him, but from what I've heard and read about, during his earlier works, he was talking more about, when you encounter works such as, Aristotle, for example, he would kind of sift through it, take the Islamic parts, and he called it the healing. So it was like doing that. So it reminded me of that kind of instance as well. So like even Islamic theologians or thinkers as well, they'll do the same thing with Greek. Obviously, like Imam Ghazali, for example, take the good, leave the bad. So it reflects throughout, not just architecture and all that, but obviously through...
Absolutely. And when Muslim thinkers often encountered philosophers like that, Plato, Aristotle, they approach it in two different ways. They either said the Greeks must have derived wisdom from a prophet they were sent, or because they were so close to the Middle East and Egypt, somehow through Moses and the Mosaic tradition, because of course many of the early Greeks studied in Egypt. Plato spent years in Egypt, and Pythagoras. Or that somehow through their own fitrah you can discover certain realities. And so in both three instances they gave them the benefit of the doubt, right? And they embraced, as you said, what was universal and what was acceptable and what wasn't. Likewise with Islamic art. Look at Islamic art today and throughout the ages. In Muslim Spain, for example, in other parts of Europe where Islam receded and but its architectural expressions remained, many of the buildings remained to this day because largely because of the mesmerizing quality of the universal geometry adopted in it. And even today, people can feel like they can find a profound link and mesmerized by Islamic geometry because it resonates with this. It's one thing to, we can all to a certain extent relate to an image of the Buddha or image of Christ, but much more profoundly we can relate to geometric patterns and non-figurative art forms, which brings Islam well into the 21st century, by the way. Because we live in an age today in which there's a fundamental, remarkable networking across the world, and networking various cultures together, which is something Islam has done perfectly well. But you find that many of the discussions in contemporary abstract or virtual reality art resonate deeply with some of the medieval discussions, Islamic discussions on art, because both explore similar questions in relationship to the nature of matter, the nature of virtual reality and existence, and universality. Today, we live in an age of such universal global culture that we're exploring many questions that I think Islam has already dealt with quite maturely and has a lot to offer to the contemporary discussion and debate.
Yeah, I was just about to ask you to bring us back to the modern world and sort of how Islam can bring our tradition into the underpinnings that we have today and the sort of philosophies that inform our architecture today. What would you say is sort of the in vogue or contemporary way of going about architecture and art at this present moment in time? Would it be like a postmodern sort of stylistic?
I think a lot of the contemporary. I think we need more in-depth discussions and debates about art and architecture today, because so many of our mosques built in the 20th century and now being built now under the guise of postmodernism are still experimentations with several different kind of tendencies. Either you find in some places where traditional mosques are being designed as if nothing has changed or happened. So a mosque made out of sandstone, it looks exactly like a mosque from the 19th century, in terms of material, in terms of space and everything. Or you find on the opposite extreme, a complete abandonment of traditional mosque architecture, exploring the new, the postmodern. And you find, for example, there's a mosque that was recently built in Turkey that was inspired by Sut al-Kahf. So it's like a cave underground, the mosque.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And
where was this again, sorry?
It's in Turkey. It's in Istanbul. I think it's a new mosque somewhere.
Okay, that's got to be a hideout. Boys in the cave.
And then you find in between these two mosques, like the Cambridge Muslim Mosque, the new Cambridge Mosque in the UK, that is in some ways still recognizably Islamic, but extremely inspired by the context where it is, which is 21st century Cambridge. So some elements in the building are inspired by the old Gothic architecture of Cambridge.
Of Cambridge itself.
And it's one of the most eco-friendly mosques in Europe in terms of its reliance on passive ways of cooling and heating the building. Its collection of rainwater, drainage, etc. The garden, it has a cafe, fronting. It's trying to recover the importance of the garden and the street front as a almost like an intermediary space between the public and the private space of the mosque. And then you have in between these three different shades, there isn't a mature discourse today on what constitutes Islamic architecture. For example, is a dome essential to a mosque? Is a minaret essential to a mosque? A dome was adopted from Byzantine architecture, for example, right? So pre-Umayyad architecture, in the mosque in Medina, the early mosques, Muslim mosques, didn't have domes necessarily. They just had a flat roof. They didn't necessarily have the tall minarets that they have today. So the question is, to what extent are these elements bound by certain cultures? To what extent are they intrinsically important for every mosque? And to what extent can we, in Muslims, follow the model of previous Muslim generations in really properly integrating our architecture into the local cultural context.
It's interesting how you say even the dome and the minarets themselves were a borrowing of different cultural tradition, because we think of those in the modern time as completely essential to a masjid, and we don't realize how that's sort of been a part of a history and trajectory where it's been adopted. So that you could use that same argument for a modern time, as you said, with the Cambridge Muslim College, how it's adopted elements of its cultural context.
Muslim Mosque, Cambridge Mosque.
Cambridge Mosque.
Yeah.
So is that what you would say to be the vision for how architecture and mosque should be built nowadays? Or
I think what's interesting about the Cambridge Mosque, the new Cambridge Mosque, is that in its initial design, it currently has a small dome.
Yeah.
In its initial design, it didn't have one. But it was adopted later, I think, by the designer and the patrons and the community, because the community really wanted something recognizable. And so, although the mosque is not part of the essential function of a mosque, the dome is not essential part of the function of the mosque, because it's been around for over 1400 years in history, it's part of our collective memory and meaning and experience of what a mosque is. Yeah. So there's an argument to suggest that it is absolutely essential for creating this continuity and bridge between the past and the future. Yeah. And then maybe in the future generations, it may be something that we can, gradually give way to something else. We're still in an experimental phase. It's not entirely clear. I think each community in the West is doing its own thing. If you look at the first mosques built by the first generation of people who immigrated to the West, like the Lakemba Mosque next door, it was built and designed to be recognizably like
Islamic
mosque from Lebanon. But it was designed to look like a mosque from contemporary Lebanon. Right? It doesn't look like necessarily
the older mosques,
an older or more traditional mosque. And so because mosques become a hub for communities, a nexus of identity, its recognizable form creates that kind of sense of continuity and comfort. It's interesting where things are heading and the conversations that happen, but we need the conversation to happen, and we need to rediscover the importance of things. I always argue, for example, on mosque panels, the importance of having a garden. Many Muslims see it as secondary to the function of the mosque. But increasingly, for example, and this is where understanding the age we live in is so important. The garden is in an age in which we're so alienated from nature these days, and especially living in the West, in a place where the mosque needs to be more than just a place for community, but also a place that can communicate to the wider Australian public. Having a garden, a welcoming garden at the front of the mosque, that welcome and transition. It functions both as a green space, reconnecting to the very quality of heaven on earth. Yeah. But at the same time, it functions as an outreach to the wider Australian community and invite them into the space to enjoy it. So we need to think about things in the context of where we're living, and a lot more of these discussions need to happen.
That would be pretty cool. Like going to a mosque, pick up a few carrots and apples on the way. You're walking in and out.
If you look at the Mughal period in India, they created vast gardens in front of the masjids, as you said, as a replication of heaven on earth. That was the sort of ideal with that.
Oh, absolutely. But then again, another question raises itself here. Traditional Islamic gardens consisted of 4 quadrants. Walled garden with 4 rivers. Yeah. Is that essential to what is an Islamic garden? Or is that essential to our image of what an Islamic garden is? You can go either way. But I think we don't need to be... And if we go back to this universality... See, the Muslims today are trying to reclaim a sense of link to history, Islamic history. Yeah. But often in the process, we're trying to reclaim historical, cultural patterns that are not absolutely essential to what it means to be a Muslim. But it may be essential to what it means for me to be a Muslim, comfortable in my identity as a South Asian Muslim in Australia, or a Middle Eastern Muslim in Australia. Right? If we're aware of these issues, we can then really start thinking, well, in England, for example, is the English garden not Islamic? What is an Islamic garden? Islamic garden is nature.
Yeah.
No? Is a Japanese Zen garden not Islamic, for example?
Yeah, because you go past like a Zen type Chinese garden. Our friend Raphael has like a Zen type garden. It's like you don't have any Islamic connection to. You're just like, it's like a Japanese. Don't touch it. Don't go near it. But then it's like, what is actually like a Islamic garden? What's wrong with actually connecting with other traditions and reclaiming it, like we discussed before, like making it kind of our own? You know what I mean?
Absolutely. And so our need to replicate a Mughal or Andalusian garden has more to do with our current state of trying to reclaim our identity or historical roots, more than what Islam necessarily requires.
Exactly, yeah. Just to kind of final question I want to ask, because I was listening to your lecture, and you mentioned a point about geometry and mystical geometry. So how I kind of, went about high school doing maths, probably didn't pay too much attention in class, but besides the point, you see geometry and it's like, you just think of shapes and cubes. Let's count the number of edges of a prism, and that's how you see geometry, right? But then you brought up mystical geometry, which I can't conceptualize and didn't know what that actually meant. Or maybe my conception of what geometry might be different. So would you be able to elaborate a bit further?
And I think also we learn it at a very rudimentary level, just about the level of maths we learn doesn't go towards that sort of geometrical abstraction and design, which I think in university, if you study pure mathematics, it goes a bit deeper.
Yeah, I mean, look, where the Muslims adopted the Pythagorean Greek theory that underpinning the cosmos, the universe, number and geometry, but not geometry as you and I understand it today.
Yeah.
Not necessarily the geometric pattern that you see necessarily, but geometry and number somehow underpin the physical fabric of the universe around us, which meant that for them, geometry is almost a sneak peek behind the curtains. If you look around today in the physical world, you don't see geometry anywhere.
Okay.
Do you see geometry anywhere? You don't see it absolutely anywhere. You're hard-pressed to find a straight line or perfect circle or cubes anywhere, right? To the visible eye. But behind the fabric of reality, as it were, there was a principle of numbers and geometric patterns. And if we know now, for example, from science, that indeed many flowers open up with a certain kind of geometric pattern, according to a golden ratio, etc., etc. So this is largely established today to a large extent. But Muslims were convinced of this. And so geometry provided them a sneak peek behind the very fabric of reality. And so when you gaze into geometry then, what happens when you look at geometry, for example, is very different from what happens when you look at the physical world. You've already entered, when you look at geometry, you've already entered into
the hidden layer,
the realm of the unseen. You're already entered into a realm behind the physical. And so that was automatically already conducive, because it lacked any images, was conducive to instilling a certain meditative state, a state of reverie, almost like a dream state, a waking dream state, in which the calligraphy that accompanies the geometry, like, God created the seven heavens and earth, etc., would trigger certain imaginative and experiential flights based on meditating on the Quran, but as a result of the geometry already putting you in a certain kind of state or condition. And so they really exploited the possibilities of geometry in this sense. And so when you look at, for example, some of the Muqarnas patterns, the very complicated stalactite beehive patterns that you find at the entrance to mosques or domes, if you look at some of the writings about these, they were almost as if they were more accurate representations of the complex fabric of reality than 4 columns and a ceiling. And so they were exploring what we would today call the virtual world, virtual reality. What is virtual reality? Virtual reality is not necessarily the reality you see on the screen and TV. In English, the word virtual means a world that is, if you want to call it, in the realm of imagination, or a world that is beyond the physical, but nonetheless real, right? That's a virtual world. And so they were exploring the possibilities of entering into this unseen world through these kind of patterns and geometry. And so today, when we look at the philosophy of virtual reality today, they're raising some very interesting questions. For example, how do we understand the possibilities of parallel world? Today, the virtual reality is just consigned to the infinity of the internet or the virtual world, right? But in the medieval world, the virtual reality or virtual world was the infinite reality of existence itself. It's seen as an infinite network of connections across time and space, right? And so if you look at some of the questions raised here in medieval Islamic theology and discussions on the nature of the possibilities of geometric form to allow you to enter into this virtual other world, and the questions in contemporary 21st century algorithmic network philosophy, you find that, oh, hang on a minute, there's some interesting stuff going on here. That's why I said Islamic aesthetics and art is extremely relevant today. Extremely relevant. And maybe in another podcast we can really hash out in more detail in the future, inshallah, what these parallels are. But so when you enter into a mosque where there's so much geometric patterns, you're entering into another world, right? You feel like you're in some other, but it's not in any concrete terms bound by the image of an icon or a saint or anything like that. It's just another virtual, imaginative world in which you're in a state of reverie, right? And geometric patterns, doing geometry, as Ibn Khaldun describes it, and Ibn al-Haytham, purifies the soul. Why? Because it allows you to enter into that realm.
Geometry was sort of a grasping at a world beyond. Like if you see some of the Iranian masjids, how beautiful the masjids are
light,
inside.
color, geometry.
It's sort of dazzling, I guess. If you look at the patterns, it's like, how can you, like, you can't even grasp it totally. It's sort of sublime in a sense. Yeah.
And it's not a world that it's dictating any images to you, because we can't.
Exactly. Yeah.
But it's entering you
it
into
allows
that
your
world.
imagination, I guess. Yeah.
And to the Quran, your recitation of the Quran and prayer and salawat and reading of the calligraphy in those spaces then allows you and myself and other people to enter into that world defined by our own understanding and our own experience and of this reality, this world, right?
Yes. I think that was super deep. This podcast probably took our viewers into a different dimension as well. So I think that's a beautiful way to kind of wrap it up. It was a huge episode, but inshallah, I think a lot of people would have benefited. A lot of diverse topics we kind of touched on, architecture, philosophy and geometry as well. So jazakallah khair for coming on board. Shout out to Mizan Avenue and Lebanese Muslim Association again for allowing us to have this conversation with Dr. Samir Mahmoud, inshallah, because you mentioned you used to kind of live here, inshallah. We have that different realm connection where we can probably do another.
Even if you're overseas, inshallah, if you ever come by again.
Inshallah, we'll touch on different topics inshallah in depth. So for all our listeners, thank you for giving us your attention. If you ever have any questions or comments, feel free to email us at boysinthecave@gmail.com or find us on Facebook. And you can also follow our journey through Instagram. Please leave us a 5-star rating on iTunes, as that greatly helps us. So you just pop onto your podcast app on your iPhone and you subscribe to Boys in the Cave, search us up, and you scroll down, you got the 5-star ratings, inshallah. So if you ever want to, kind of meet us or talk to us, inshallah, it's just brothers, like not sisters, but to discuss anything about what we talked about, feel free to do so. We had a few people that messaged us that want to meet us, so we're open to do that, inshallah. And so from our special guest, Dr. Samir Mahmoud, Josh and myself, we wish you all the best. This is Tanzim signing off. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.
وربطنا على قلوبهم إذ قاموا فقالوا ربنا رب السماوات والأرض لن ندعو من دونه إلها لقد قلنا إذا شططا هؤلاء قوم اتخذوا من دونه آلهة لولا يأتون عليهم بسلطان بين فمن أظلم ممن افترى على الله كذبا